Get on your knees, and I'll wire the 1 million right now. The words didn't echo. They cut, clean and precise, slicing through the soft clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of jazz like a blade in silk. For a moment, time hesitated. A waiter mid-step froze beside a table of investors. A woman in a diamond bracelet stopped, swirling her wine. Even the pianist missed a note, just one, but enough to fracture the illusion of elegance that had filled the room seconds before. At the center of it all stood Richard Calloway, a man worth more than most cities, his tailored navy suit catching the amber light like armor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power, real power, never does. It simply assumes it will be obeyed. Across from him, still as a held breath, stood Ava Brooks. 24. Black. A waitress in a pressed black uniform that fit her like discipline, not decoration. Her name tag caught the light, but no one had bothered to read it before this moment. To them, she had been part of the background, like the music, like the glassware, like anything designed to serve and disappear. But now, every eye in the room found her. Not because she spoke, not because she moved, but because she didn't. Her hands rested lightly against the tray at her side, steady, controlled, as if the air around her hadn't just shifted into something heavier, something charged. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might study a piece of art they were considering buying or discarding. It's simple, he added, his voice smooth, almost bored. You do exactly what I say. I transfer the money before you even stand back up. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room, not from amusement, but from discomfort disguised as compliance. No one wanted to be the first to react. No one wanted to be the one who misunderstood the rules of this unspoken game. Because in rooms like this, there were always rules. And Richard Calloway wrote most of them. Ava didn't look away. She didn't shrink. But something behind her eyes shifted. Not fear, not anger, something sharper. Recognition. As if she had seen this moment before, in different rooms, with different faces, wearing different suits. The manager near the bar took a half step forward, then stopped, uncertainty tightening his jaw. Interfering wasn't in the job description. Not when millions of dollars and reputation sat at the table. Ava's voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You want me to earn it? She asked, calm, almost curious. Richard smiled, slow and satisfied, mistaking composure for surrender. Exactly. The word landed like a contract. Around them, phones remained discreetly lowered, but attention sharpened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Something was unfolding, something people would talk about later in quieter rooms, with careful wording and selective memory. Ava shifted her weight slightly, just enough to set the tray down on the nearest table with deliberate care. The soft click of porcelain meeting would sounded louder than it should have. Then she looked back at him, not up at him, not down at him, but directly at him. Equal. All right, she said. A single word. Simple. Accepting. But not yielding. Richard's grin widened. Confident. Absolute. The grin of a man who had never mistaken silence for strategy because he had never needed to. He reached for his phone, already unlocking it, already preparing to turn a moment into a transaction. What he didn't see, what no one in that room saw yet, was the shift that had already begun. Not in the air, not in the crowd, but in the terms. Because Ava Brooks hadn't just heard the offer. She had understood it. And more importantly, she had already started rewriting it. Richard's thumb hovered over the screen for just a fraction longer than necessary, the glow of his phone casting a pale light across his fingers as if even the device understood the weight of what came next. One tap, and $1 million would move like water, effortless, unquestioned. Around him, the room leaned in without moving, a silent gravity pulling every gaze toward the center of the moment. Ava did not rush him. She did not fill the silence. She let it stretch, thin and delicate, until it became something else entirely, something intentional. Before you send it, she said, her voice steady, measured like a metronome, I want to be clear on the terms. The words were simple, but they did not belong to the role he had assigned her. Richard's eyes lifted from the screen, a flicker of curiosity cutting through his confidence. Terms were not something he expected from her. Terms were something he dictated. A man near the back shifted in his seat, sensing the shift before understanding it. Ava took one small step forward, not closing the distance, but claiming her place within it. You said I do exactly what you say, she continued, her tone calm, almost professional, as if they were discussing a contract over coffee instead of dignity in a room full of strangers. And the money is transferred immediately. No conditions after. No revisions. No interpretation later. A quiet murmur moved through the tables, subtle but present, like wind brushing through tall grass. Richard exhaled through his nose, a soft, amused sound, the kind reserved for moments he still believed he controlled. You are negotiating now? He asked, not mocking, not yet, but clearly entertained. Ava did not smile. I am confirming, she replied. The distinction landed sharper than any raised voice could have. Richard studied her again, this time longer, as if trying to locate the flaw in her composure. He had seen confidence before. He had bought it, broken it, rewarded it. But this was different. This was not trying to impress him. This was not trying to survive him. This was something else entirely. Fine, he said at last, slipping the phone into his palm with renewed certainty. You get your clarity. I get my show. A few guests let out quiet breaths they did not realize they had been holding. The balance, fragile as it was, seemed to settle back into his favor. Ava nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then I need one more thing, she said. Richard's brow lifted slightly. Of course you do. There it was again, that faint ripple of amusement, the confidence of a man who believed every request only deepened her compliance. Ava turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the room without breaking her focus. Someone here needs to witness it, she said. Clearly. A pause followed, shorter this time, but heavier. A man in a charcoal suit near the bar straightened, recognizing the language not as defiance, but as structure, as agreement, as something binding. Richard's smile thinned just a fraction, not enough for most to notice, but enough to exist. You think this needs witnesses? He asked. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. You said it yourself, she replied. You want a show. The words settled over the room like a quiet verdict. What had begun as a spectacle was slowly, almost invisibly, becoming something else. Something with rules. Something with consequences. Richard let out a soft laugh, shaking his head as if indulging a clever child. Fine, he said, louder now, addressing the room as much as her. You all heard it. $1 million. Immediate transfer. She does exactly as I say. A few heads nodded. A few phones shifted slightly higher, no longer hidden. Ava did not react to the attention. She simply watched him, waiting. Because the moment he spoke it out loud, the moment he made it real, the moment he believed he had secured control, was the exact moment he gave it away. Ava did not move right away, and that was the first thing that felt wrong to anyone paying close attention. In a room where every action usually followed wealth like gravity, hesitation did not belong. But this was not hesitation. It was timing. She let the words settle, let the witnesses absorb what had just been declared, let the invisible lines of agreement draw themselves around Richard without him noticing. Then she inhaled, slow and controlled, the kind of breath that does not prepare someone to obey, but to act. All right, she said again, softer this time, but somehow carrying further. Richard straightened slightly, slipping fully into the moment he believed he owned. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, his presence expanding as if the room itself adjusted to accommodate his expectation. Then let us begin, he said, his tone smooth, almost theatrical now, aware of the audience, aware of the attention, feeding on it. A few people shifted in their seats, leaning forward just enough to signal interest without admitting involvement. Someone near the bar raised a phone, no longer pretending not to record. Ava noticed, but did not acknowledge it. She stepped forward one pace, stopping at a distance that felt deliberate, not submissive. Her posture remained straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression neutral in a way that refused to give him the reaction he was waiting for. Richard's lips curved slightly, sensing what he thought was compliance. First, he said, pausing just long enough to ensure every ear was tuned to him. I want you to show everyone exactly how far you are willing to go for that money. The words landed with a weight that was meant to bend her, meant to shape her into something smaller in front of the crowd. A faint ripple moved through the room again, subtle, uneasy, but still no one spoke. Ava tilted her head just slightly, as if considering the instruction, as if measuring it against something unseen. Exactly as you say, she repeated, her voice even, returning his own condition to him like a mirror. Richard nodded once, satisfied, confident, unaware that repetition was not submission but reinforcement. Good, he said. Then follow through. Silence followed, thicker this time, stretching longer, pressing in from all sides. Ava lowered her gaze for the first time, but not in defeat. It was focus, a recalibration. Her fingers moved slightly, not fidgeting, but deliberate, as if aligning invisible pieces into place. Then she moved. Slowly, calmly, she shifted her weight and bent forward, just enough to signal the beginning of an action. A few gasps escaped before they could be stopped, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Richard's expression did not change. If anything, it settled deeper into certainty. This was what he expected. This was how it always ended. Power extended, dignity exchanged, silence purchased. But Ava did not continue. She stopped halfway, holding the motion in suspension, as if the moment itself had been paused by her choice. Then she lifted her head again and looked directly at him. Not upward, not downward, directly. You said exactly as you say, she repeated once more, her tone unchanged. Richard's smile flickered, just slightly this time, the first crack too small for most to notice, but real enough to exist. That is correct, he replied. Ava straightened fully, returning to her original stance, undoing the expectation as cleanly as it had been built. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Something had not gone according to script. Then I will need you to say it clearly, she said, her voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a precision that sharpened every word, every instruction, out loud. So there is no confusion. The room did not move, but it changed. The balance tilted, just a fraction, just enough to be felt before it was understood. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in recalculation. Because for the first time since he spoke, the performance was no longer entirely his. Richard did not answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than anything he had said so far. For a man who controlled boardrooms, markets, and men with a glance, being asked to clarify himself was not just unusual, it was unfamiliar. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, not enough to break composure, but enough to signal that something had shifted beneath the surface. The room felt it. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the subtle recalibration of power that happens when certainty meets resistance. He let out a quiet breath, then straightened his posture as if resetting the scene back into his favor. You are overcomplicating this, he said, his tone calm, but no longer amused. Ava did not respond to the tone. She responded to the structure. You asked for precision, she said, her voice still level, still controlled, still impossible to read. So I am making sure there is no misunderstanding. A man near the center table shifted again, this time more noticeably, his fingers tapping once against the edge of his glass before stopping. He understood what was happening, even if he could not yet name it. This was no longer a moment of humiliation. It was becoming something procedural, something documented. Richard glanced briefly around the room, just for a second, as if confirming that the attention was still his. It was, but it no longer felt the same. There was a difference now, subtle but undeniable. They were not just watching her anymore. They were watching him. Fine, he said at last, his voice sharper now, more deliberate. You want clarity? I will give you clarity. He took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to reassert presence, to remind everyone who stood at the center of this moment. You will kneel, he said, clearly this time, each word measured, each syllable placed like a signature. The sentence landed in the air, heavier now that it had been spoken without ambiguity. A few people lowered their eyes. Others leaned in further. Ava did not react immediately. She let the words exist, let them be heard, let them become real in a way that could not be undone. Then she nodded once, slow and controlled. And after that, she asked. Richard's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation breaking through. After that, he repeated, as if the continuation were obvious. You will thank me for the opportunity. A faint murmur moved through the room again, quieter this time, more restrained, as if people were no longer sure how they were supposed to feel about what they were witnessing. Ava's eyes did not leave his. Out loud, she asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Structure. Documentation. Witness. Richard hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Out loud, he confirmed. Ava drew in a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment. And the transfer happens immediately after I complete exactly what you said, she continued, her voice precise, each word reinforcing the boundaries he had already agreed to. No delay. No conditions added later. Richard exhaled through his nose again, sharper this time, impatience beginning to replace confidence. Yes, he said. Immediately. Ava nodded again, as if concluding a negotiation, not accepting a command. Then I understand, she said. The room held its breath without realizing it. Because something about the way she said those words did not sound like surrender. It sounded like confirmation. Richard stepped back slightly, gesturing with one hand, as if presenting a stage he had already claimed. Go ahead, he said. Ava did not move right away. She looked at him for one more second, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something he did not fully grasp yet. Then she shifted her weight again, the same controlled motion as before, the same deliberate pace. She bent her knees slowly, lowering herself toward the floor, the movement calm, measured, undeniable. A few people turned away. Others watched more closely. But just before she reached the ground, she stopped again, held there, suspended between action and choice. And then she spoke. Thank you, she said, her voice clear, steady, carrying through the entire room. Not to him, to the witnesses. The difference was small, but it changed everything. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it landed in the wrong direction. It was not directed upward toward power. It was cast outward, toward the room, toward the witnesses who had now become something more than passive observers. A few heads lifted slightly, subtle but noticeable, as if they had just been addressed directly for the first time that night. Richard caught it, not immediately in logic, but instinctively in discomfort. Something about that thank you did not belong to him. And for a man accustomed to ownership of every outcome, that detail mattered. Finish it, he said, his voice firmer now, less polished, as if trying to pull the moment back into alignment. Ava did not argue. She did not hesitate. She completed the motion, lowering fully, her posture controlled, her expression unchanged. No drama, no resistance, no performance, just completion. And that, somehow, made it more unsettling. The room did not react the way Richard expected. There was no laughter, no applause, no release. Only a silence that felt heavier than before, thicker, harder to breathe through. Ava lifted her head slightly, not enough to shift position, just enough to be heard clearly. You asked for this, she said, her voice even, almost reflective, as if stating a fact rather than assigning blame. Richard exhaled, impatient now, reaching for his phone again. And I delivered what I promised, he replied, tapping the screen with a sharper motion than before. So we are done. The sentence was meant to close the moment, to seal it, to restore the balance he believed he had demonstrated. But Ava did not stand. Not yet. Instead, she spoke again. Not yet, she said. 2 words. Calm. Controlled. But impossible to ignore. Richard paused, his thumb hovering again, irritation now visible in the set of his jaw. What do you mean not yet, he asked. Ava lifted her gaze fully now, meeting his eyes from where she remained, not in submission, but in precision. You said I would do exactly what you said, she replied. And I did. She let that settle, let the agreement replay in every mind in the room. Then you said I would thank you. Out loud. A few people shifted again, the memory of his words now clearer, sharper, harder to dismiss. Ava continued, her tone unchanged. But you also agreed that the transfer happens immediately after I complete exactly what you said. Richard's expression tightened, just slightly, as the structure he had accepted began to close around him. Yes, he said, more forcefully now. And I am doing that. Ava nodded once. Then there is only one thing left, she said. The room leaned in again, not physically, but emotionally, pulled by something they could now feel even if they could not yet define it. Ava's voice softened just a fraction, not weaker, but more precise, like the final line of a contract being read aloud. You told me to kneel, she said. And I did. She paused, just long enough to let the next words land with full weight. But you never said I had to stay here. The shift was immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Ava placed one hand lightly against the floor, steadying herself, then rose in one smooth, controlled motion, returning to her full height without rush, without hesitation, without asking permission. The movement was quiet, but it broke something. Not in the room. In the expectation. Richard blinked once, the first real break in his composure, small but visible to anyone watching closely. Ava stood in front of him again, exactly where she had been before, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her presence now impossible to overlook. "So now," she said, her voice steady, carrying through the room with quiet authority, "we are done." And for the first time that night, the words did not sound like his anymore. For a second, no one moved, not because they were unsure what had happened, but because they had just witnessed something they did not expect to understand so quickly. The shift was complete now. Not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Richard Calloway stood there, phone still in his hand, the glow from the screen fading as it dimmed, as if even the device had lost interest in waiting for his command. His eyes stayed on Ava, but they no longer carried the same certainty. There was something else there now. Calculation. Not dominance. Not yet defeat. But the first recognition that the rules had changed without his permission. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice controlled, but tighter than before, like a thread pulled just a little too far. Ava did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, composed, steady, as if the question itself did not require urgency. "You said the transfer happens immediately after I complete exactly what you said," she replied, her tone calm, almost neutral, but each word placed with deliberate precision. The room felt it again. That structure, that clarity, that quiet pressure that did not need force to hold weight. Richard glanced down at his phone for a brief moment, then back at her, as if expecting the situation to resolve itself the way it always had before. But nothing moved. Nothing shifted back. The room did not return to him. "And I completed it," Ava continued, not interrupting, not pushing, just finishing the line he had already agreed to. A man near the bar cleared his throat softly, not to speak, but because the silence had become too dense to hold without sound. Someone else adjusted their seat. A glass touched the table with a soft click. Small noises. Human noises. But none of them broke the moment. Richard inhaled slowly, then exhaled through his nose again, this time not as a gesture of control, but as an attempt to regain it. "You will get your money," he said, finally tapping his screen, more deliberately now, as if the act itself needed to prove something. Ava did not look at the phone. She did not watch the transfer. She watched him, because this was no longer about the money. It had not been for a while. A soft vibration broke the tension, faint but unmistakable. Ava's phone, resting in her apron pocket, buzzed once. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. She reached for it slowly, not in a rush, not in disbelief, but in confirmation. Her eyes dropped to the screen for just a second, long enough to register what had already been decided. Then she looked back up. "Thank you," she said again. The same words, the same tone, but now they carried something entirely different. Not gratitude, not submission, closure. Richard's jaw tightened, just enough to be seen now, no longer hidden beneath composure. Because in that moment, he understood something he had not expected to learn tonight. He had paid, but he had not won. Ava slipped the phone back into her pocket with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. No celebration, no reaction, no need. The room, however, had changed completely. Eyes that once passed over her now followed her. Not out of curiosity, not out of novelty, but out of recognition. She turned slightly, not away from him, but away from the center he had once occupied, and reached for the tray she had set down earlier. The simple motion, quiet and ordinary, carried more weight than anything that had come before, because it restored something. Not her role, not her position, but her choice. Richard remained where he stood, still at the center, but no longer holding it. And for the first time that night, the room did not feel like it belonged to him anymore. The sound that followed was not applause, not laughter, not even relief. It was something quieter, something more unsettling. It was awareness. One by one, people began to move again, but differently now, slower, more deliberate, as if they were no longer part of a shared illusion. A woman near the window lowered her glass without drinking. A man in a tailored gray suit glanced at Richard, then quickly looked away, not out of respect, but calculation. Because, in rooms like this, power was not just seen, it was measured. And tonight, something had shifted on that scale. Ava lifted the tray with both hands, steady and controlled, the same way she had done 100 times before. The same motion, the same posture, but it did not look the same anymore. Because now, every movement carried intention. Every step carried choice. She turned toward a nearby table, her pace calm, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had. Richard remained where he stood, his phone still in his hand, though it no longer served a purpose. The transaction had been completed. The moment had passed. But the impact lingered, heavier than any number he could transfer. He cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound, attempting to reclaim something that no longer responded to him. "Everyone," he said, his voice firm, projecting outward again, reaching for the room that had once followed him without question. "Let us not turn this into something it is not." The words were measured, practiced, the kind that usually restored order. But this time, they landed differently. Because now there was something to compare them to. Truth. A man near the center table shifted his chair slightly, the soft scrape against the floor louder than it should have been. He did not respond. No one did. Not immediately. The silence that followed was not submission. It was distance. Ava reached the table, placing the tray down with the same quiet precision as before. "Still sparkling, or would you like something else?" she asked, her tone professional, her focus on the guest in front of her, not the man behind her. The question was simple, ordinary, but it carried a quiet defiance. Life continued, not around power, around dignity. The guest blinked, momentarily unsure how to respond, then nodded quickly. "Sparkling is fine," he said, his voice softer than before. Ava poured the water, steady, precise, without a single tremor. No rush, no hesitation. The room watched her again, but this time not as an object of spectacle, as a point of reference. Something had been redefined, and they were still catching up to it. Behind her, Richard shifted his weight. Just slightly, the first physical sign that the center no longer held him the same way. His gaze moved across the room, searching for alignment, for acknowledgement, for anything that would restore the balance he understood. But what he found instead were eyes that no longer avoided him, and no longer followed him either. They simply observed. Equal, neutral, unmoved. Ava finished pouring and stepped back, placing the bottle down with care. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, offering a small, polite nod before turning away. Not toward him, not away from him, just forward. As she walked, the space seemed to open for her, not out of obligation, but recognition. A path created not by status, but by presence. Richard watched her go, his expression unreadable now, the certainty that once defined him replaced by something quieter, something less familiar. Not defeat, not yet, but awareness. Because for the first time in a very long time, he had encountered something he could not purchase, could not command, could not control. And it did not raise its voice. It did not resist. It simply stood its ground and changed everything. The music resumed, but not the same way. The notes were correct, the rhythm intact, but something underneath had shifted, like a song played in a room that no longer believed in its own illusion. Conversations restarted in fragments, cautious at first, voices lowered, words chosen more carefully than before. No one announced it. No one needed to. The room had recalibrated. Ava moved between tables with the same quiet efficiency she had always carried, but now each step seemed to register differently, not as service, but as presence. She did not look back. She did not check if anyone was watching. She did not need to, because now they were. A man seated near the far end of the room adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes following her just long enough to betray a thought he did not say out loud. Another guest leaned closer to his companion, whispering something too soft to hear, but not soft enough to hide the shift in tone. It was no longer dismissal. It was recognition. Behind them, a phone screen glowed faintly, angled just enough to capture what had already happened. The moment was not over. It had only changed form. Richard Calloway stood still for a second longer than he intended, then slipped his phone into his pocket with a controlled motion, the kind that usually marked the end of a decision. But this time, it did not feel final. It felt incomplete. His gaze moved again, scanning the room, searching not for approval, but for alignment. But alignment did not return. Not the way it used to. He took a step forward, then another, slower this time, as if recalculating where he stood without the automatic deference he had grown used to. "Ava," he said, calling her name for the first time that night. Not loud, not commanding, just enough to reach her. She stopped, not abruptly, not reluctantly, just precisely. She turned, meeting his gaze across the room, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something subtle but undeniable took shape. He no longer looked down at her. He looked at her. "A word," he said, his tone measured, controlled, but no longer certain of its effect. Ava did not move toward him. She did not refuse either. She simply waited. The distance remained. Deliberate. Equal. "I am working," she replied, her voice calm, professional, but carrying a clarity that did not bend. It was not rejection. It was boundary. A few heads turned again, not toward her this time, but toward him. Watching. Measuring. The same way they had measured her before. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. A small gesture. Almost imperceptible, but real. "When you are finished," he said. Not a command. Not a demand. A request. The word hung there, unfamiliar in his voice. Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the sentence without accepting anything beyond what was said. "If I am available," she replied. The distinction was quiet, but precise. The kind that leaves no room for assumption. Richard did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her for a second longer, then turned away, returning to his table without another word. The movement was controlled, composed, but different. Because for the first time that night, he was not leading the moment. He was following it. Ava resumed her path, her steps steady, her focus forward, her presence unchanged. But the room had already changed around her. Because power had not disappeared, it had been redefined. And everyone there knew it, even if no one said it out loud. Time moved forward, but it did not feel the same. The room had settled into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer revolved around a single center, but flowed around something less visible, less controllable. Ava continued her shift with the same measured precision, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving through conversations that no longer overlooked her presence. But beneath the surface, something else was unfolding, something slower, more deliberate. At a corner table, two men in tailored suits leaned closer over a tablet, their voices low but intent. One of them tapped the screen, replaying a short clip, the glow reflecting in his eyes. It was not difficult to recognize the scene. The angle was slightly tilted, the audio imperfect, but the moment was unmistakable. The agreement. The words. The shift. The other man exhaled softly, shaking his head once. "That is going to circulate," he murmured. Not as a question, as a fact. Across the room, another guest scrolled through his phone, pausing, then looking up again toward Ava with a different kind of attention. Not curiosity, not judgment, consideration. Richard sat at his table, untouched glass of water in front of him, condensation forming a thin ring against the polished wood. His fingers rested lightly against the edge, but he did not drink. His gaze moved once more, not searching now, but observing, learning. The room had not turned against him. It had simply stopped bending. And that difference mattered. A woman seated across from him adjusted her posture, her expression polite but distant, as if recalibrating her understanding of the man she had been speaking to minutes earlier. "That was unexpected," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. Richard gave a small nod, not defensive, not dismissive, but measured. "So was the response," he replied. His tone carried no humor this time. Only acknowledgement. Ava approached another table, placing a dish down with steady hands, her movements uninterrupted by the quiet ripples spreading through the room. She did not check her phone again. She did not revisit the moment. She simply continued. But the moment did not leave her. It moved outward, carried in fragments of video, in whispers, in glances that now held weight. A man near the bar stood up, adjusting his jacket as he stepped aside to take a call, his voice low but urgent. "No, you need to see this," he said, turning slightly away, though his eyes remained on the room. "Yes, tonight. I am telling you, it changes the narrative. The words were quiet, but their meaning traveled. Narrative, not incident, not scene, something larger. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture still composed, but no longer anchored in certainty. His eyes followed Ava again as she moved across the floor, not with possession, not with dismissal, but with focus. For the first time, he was not assessing her role. He was trying to understand her position, and that required something he was not used to offering. Time. Ava paused briefly near the service station, placing a tray down, her fingers adjusting the edge of a folded napkin with the same care as before. A coworker glanced at her, eyes wide with something between disbelief and admiration, but Ava only gave a small nod, nothing more. No explanation, no performance, just continuation. Because whatever had happened was already complete. The rest was simply unfolding. And as the night carried on, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not. The moment they had witnessed was not about $1 million. It was about something far more expensive, and far more difficult to recover once it was lost. By the time the second hour of the evening settled in, the restaurant no longer felt like a place where something had happened. It felt like a place where something had been revealed. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different weight now, more deliberate, more aware, as if every word spoken had to pass through a new filter before it was allowed into the air. Ava moved through the space with the same steady rhythm, but the path around her had changed. Guests no longer waved her over with distracted gestures. They waited. They acknowledged. Some even straightened slightly when she approached, subtle adjustments that spoke louder than any apology could. At table 12, a man who had earlier avoided eye contact now met her gaze directly as she refilled his glass. "Thank you," he said, his voice measured, intentional. Ava gave a small nod, nothing more, and moved on. The exchange was brief, ordinary on the surface, but it carried something else beneath it. Recognition, not of service, but of presence. Across the room, the soft glow of screens continued to flicker, messages sent, clips shared, narratives forming in real time beyond the walls of the restaurant. A woman near the bar scrolled slowly, then paused, her lips pressing together as she read something that made her glance toward Richard, then back to her phone again. The story was no longer contained. It had moved beyond the room. Richard sat back in his chair, his posture still composed, but his stillness now carried a different meaning. It was not control. It was restraint. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped, as if even that small movement felt too loud in the current silence. He watched Ava again, but this time there was no attempt to define her, no immediate judgment to place her within a category he understood. There was only observation, and something quieter, something closer to respect, though he had not yet named it. The woman across from him set her phone down gently, her expression thoughtful. "It is already circulating," she said, her tone low, careful. "People are framing it as a shift." Richard gave a small nod, his eyes still forward. "It is," he replied. No denial, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. Ava reached the service station again, placing a tray down, her movements precise, unhurried. A coworker approached, hesitating for a brief second before speaking. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Ava looked at her, not surprised by the question, but not burdened by it either. "I am working," she replied, the same calm clarity in her voice, the same steady grounding in the present moment. The coworker nodded, understanding that the answer was not avoidance. It was intention. Ava adjusted the stack of glasses, aligning them with care, then picked up the tray again, stepping back into the room that now seemed to respond to her in ways it had not before. Each glance, each subtle shift, each quiet acknowledgement built something invisible but undeniable. Not attention, not fame, something steadier, something earned. Richard finally reached for his glass, lifting it slightly, but not drinking. He held it there for a moment, as if considering something beyond the simple act, then set it back down. His gaze moved once more across the room, taking in the details he had once overlooked, the dynamics he had once assumed would always bend in his favor. But they did not bend now. They held. And that changed everything. Because for a man who had built his world on leverage, on influence, on the certainty that every situation could be shaped to his advantage, this moment presented something unfamiliar. A boundary that did not resist him. It simply did not move. Ava passed his table again, her steps steady, her focus forward. She did not slow. She did not pause. She did not look at him. And that, more than anything else, made the difference clear. The room had not turned against him. It had simply learned to stand without him. And somewhere in that realization, something shifted inside him as well. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter. The night did not end with a clear conclusion, not the kind people were used to, not the kind that came with applause or a final word that neatly closed the moment. Instead, it stretched forward, carrying with it a quiet tension that refused to dissolve. By the time dessert menus were placed and coffee orders began to circulate, the room had settled into something calmer, but not forgetful. Nothing had been undone. It had simply been absorbed. Ava moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady rhythm. But now there was a difference in how people engaged with her. They spoke more clearly. They listened when she responded. They no longer interrupted. It was not dramatic. It was not announced. But it was consistent. And consistency is what changes behavior. At a table near the center, a man who had earlier been part of the quiet laughter now leaned back slightly as Ava approached, giving her space before speaking. "Whenever you are ready," he said, not rushing her, not assuming. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the respect without amplifying it, then placed the plates down with practiced precision. Across the room, a woman who had been watching for most of the evening finally stood, smoothing the front of her dress before walking slowly toward Richard's table. Her steps were measured, her expression composed, but there was something firm in her posture. "I think I will call it a night," she said, her voice polite but distant. Richard looked up at her, his expression neutral, but attentive. "Of course," he replied, standing slightly, more out of habit than expectation. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "You might want to consider how that looked." The sentence was not harsh. It was not accusatory, but it was clear. And clarity, in that moment, carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Richard held her gaze for a second, then nodded once. "I already am," he said. No defensiveness, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. She gave a small nod in return and walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt more like reflection than discomfort. Richard remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly sat back down, his movements controlled, deliberate. His eyes moved across the room again, but this time they lingered differently, not searching for control, not measuring influence, but observing impact. Because impact, once created, does not disappear. It stays. Ava returned to the service station, placing a stack of plates down, her fingers adjusting their alignment with quiet care. Her coworker glanced at her again, less hesitant this time, but still unsure how to frame the moment. "That was something," she said softly. Ava looked at her briefly, then back at the plates. "It was what it needed to be," she replied. "No more. No less." The answer did not invite further explanation. It did not require it, because whatever had happened was no longer being processed in words. It was being understood in behavior. The lights in the restaurant dimmed slightly as the evening began to wind down, casting longer shadows across the floor, softening the edges of the room. Conversations lowered. Chairs shifted. The energy transitioned from presence to departure. But even as people prepared to leave, something remained. Not tension, not discomfort, something steadier, something that had replaced what used to be there. Ava picked up one final tray and stepped back onto the floor, her movements unchanged, her pace consistent. She was still doing her job, still moving through the same space. But the space no longer treated her the same way. And that difference did not come from what she said. It came from what she refused to surrender. Across the room, Richard watched her once more, his expression no longer fixed, no longer certain, but thoughtful. Because for the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about what he could take from a moment. He was thinking about what it had just taken from him. And more importantly, what it had given him the chance to understand. Not everything can be bought. Not everything can be bent. And some things, once revealed, cannot be unseen. By the time the last round of guests began to stand, adjusting coats and checking watches, the restaurant no longer felt like a stage at all. It felt like a place that had witnessed something it would carry long after the lights dimmed. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, clearing tables, resetting spaces, but even in those familiar motions, there was a subtle difference. Not in what they did, but in how they held themselves while doing it. Ava reached the final table of her section, collecting the last set of glasses, her hands steady, her movements unchanged from the beginning of the night. But the air around her no longer pressed in the same way. It had opened. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to be felt. A man paused near the exit, glancing back one more time, his expression thoughtful, as if trying to understand why something so simple had stayed with him so deeply. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once to himself and walked out. Across the room, chairs were pushed in, tablecloth smoothed, the quiet choreography of closing time unfolding with practiced rhythm. Ava placed the final tray onto the service counter, aligning the glasses with care, the soft clink of glass against glass marking the end of her section for the night. Her co-worker approached again, this time without hesitation, her voice low but steady. "They are still talking about it," she said. Ava glanced up briefly, then back to her work. "They can," she replied, her tone calm, neither encouraging nor dismissing the statement. Because the conversation was no longer hers to manage. It had already moved beyond her. Richard remained seated longer than most, his presence now quieter, less defined by the space around him. The table that once felt like the center of gravity now felt like any other table waiting to be cleared. He reached for his jacket slowly, slipping it on with the same care he applied to every detail of his life. But there was something different in the way he paused before standing, something measured, reflective. He looked across the room one more time, his gaze settling on Ava as she moved toward the back, preparing to step off the floor. Not watching her, not assessing, just observing. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might say something, might cross the distance that had once belonged entirely to him. But he did not. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the exit, his steps controlled, deliberate, but no longer commanding the room to respond. The door opened, a brief rush of cool night air slipping inside, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city beyond. He stepped out without looking back, the door closing softly behind him. Inside, the lights dimmed another degree, signaling the final transition from service to silence. Ava removed her apron, folding it neatly, her movements precise, consistent, grounded in routine. She placed it in her locker, then paused for just a second, her reflection catching in the small mirror inside the door. Not to admire, not to question, just to acknowledge. Then she closed it. The room behind her continued its quiet descent into stillness, the echoes of the night settling into the walls, into the memory of the space itself. Because some moments do not end when people leave. They remain, shaping what comes next in ways that are not always visible, but always real. Ava stepped toward the exit reserved for staff, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged. Outside, the night waited, open and indifferent, ready to carry the story forward in ways no one inside could fully predict. And somewhere between what had been said and what had been understood, something had shifted that would not shift back. Not for her, not for him, not for anyone who had witnessed it. The city air outside was cooler than it should have been for that time of year, carrying a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if even the night itself had paused to make room for something that had just shifted. Ava stepped out through the staff entrance, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the restaurant and everything inside it into memory. For a moment, she stood there, not moving, not checking her phone, not replaying the night, just breathing. The street was not crowded, not loud, just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of headlights passing by. Normal, unchanged. And yet, something was different. Not in the world. In her. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her posture still steady, still grounded, as if nothing had tried to shake it in the first place. Because that was the truth. Nothing had. Not really. Inside, it had not been about humiliation. It had been about definition. About who decides what something means. And tonight, she had decided. A car slowed briefly at the corner, then continued on, the sound fading into the distance. Ava began to walk, her steps measured, unhurried, the rhythm of someone who was not running from anything and not chasing anything either. Just moving forward. Somewhere across the city, screens were still lit, messages still being sent, conversations still forming around what had happened. Clips replayed, words analyzed, opinions built. Some would call it bold, Some would call it defiance. Some would misunderstand it entirely. But none of that reached her now, because the moment had never belonged to them. It had belonged to a choice, and that choice had already been made. Back at the restaurant, long after the doors had closed and the last light dimmed, the space remained quiet, but not empty. It held something now. Not tension, not conflict. Something steadier. Something that would shape the next interaction, the next assumption, the next moment when someone thought they understood the rules before they had even been spoken. And for Richard Calloway, that shift did not end when he stepped outside. It followed him. In the quiet interior of the car waiting at the curb. In the reflection of his own face against the darkened window. In the absence of noise where certainty used to live. He sat there for a moment before the driver pulled away, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze unfocused, not searching, not planning, just considering. Because for the first time in a long time, the question was not what he could control next. It was what he had just witnessed. Something that did not fight him, did not resist him, did not even try to change him. It simply refused to become what he expected. And in doing so, it changed the outcome completely. Ava reached the corner, pausing briefly before crossing, the streetlight casting a soft glow across her face. Calm, composed, unchanged. There was no triumph in her expression. No need for it. Because she had not taken anything. She had simply kept what was already hers. And that was enough. She stepped forward, crossing into the next block, the sound of her footsteps steady against the pavement, fading slowly into the quiet rhythm of the city. Behind her, the night continued as it always did. But something within it had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. Because power, when stripped of its assumptions, reveals something else entirely. And dignity, when it stands without asking permission, does not need to prove itself. It only needs to remain. And that night, it did.